Hello everyone! Today I'm bringing you Sony's PS4 Controller and PS5 Controller, commonly known as DS4 and DS5. Today I'm mainly going to share the actual experience of using these two controllers on a computer, and this video does not cover the console side. And then let's talk about why many high-end players or professional gamers choose to use these two controllers and what makes them strong. Let's start with the PS4 and discuss its advantages. First, the mold is really well made, it's very comfortable to hold, and the weight is not too heavy. All its buttons use conductive rubber, which depends on personal preference. Some people like conductive rubber, while others prefer micro switches. Then there's its carbon film. The joystick is really excellent, basically at a top tier level. There's hardly any joystick that can surpass its precision, and Sony's calibration is quite aggressive, essentially with zero dead zone. Though some domestic TMA joysticks can now achieve precision close to carbon film joysticks, their price is still a bit higher. However, the feel might be a bit more comfortable than the original carbon film, so it's up to personal choice. Because of the good performance of this joystick and its excellent mold, everyone is willing to modify this controller. Now, you can understand this controller as being modifiable in everything except the mainboard. People often modify things like the front 8-way switches, shoulder micro switches, then the Type-C port joystick caps, replaceable joystick caps, and the back buttons, or some even modify the small buttons depending on personal preference. And because this controller has been out for many years, the modification community is quite extensive. And then there's the third point, which is the software ecosystem. The software I currently use for this controller mainly consists of two parts. One is its overclocking software, because its native polling rate is 250 Hz. If you can overclock it through the overclocking software, you can easily reach 1000 Hz, and this overclocking basically does not damage the controller. It just changes the polling rate of the USB interface. Then there's also its calibration website, because this joystick might have a slight drift. If there's a slight drift, you can go to the website to calibrate it, adjust the center point, and as long as it's within the outer circle, it basically doesn't affect your normal use. You can still use it, and this can significantly extend the lifespan of the joystick. Let's talk about its drawbacks. The first drawback is quite obvious, which is that there are too many counterfeits. Because the PS4 has a large sales volume, counterfeits and controllers are everywhere. And on secondhand platforms, there might be more fakes than genuine ones. Although there are websites for authentication now, if you haven't bought these controllers before, it's still not recommended to try. Or you can find a reliable seller to buy a refurbished one, which might be slightly more expensive. Then the second drawback, this draw is something I personally find inconvenient, because this controller is quite old, so it still uses an old micro USB port. And since I usually use other controllers with a different connection cable, having to get a separate cable just for this one is quite annoying. However, there is a solution for this, because the first point is to modify it into a Type-C port, but this requires sanding the casing because the Type-C port is larger. You need to sand the casing a bit for the Type-C to fit, and you also need to buy an adapter board to use this port. Another option is to buy an adapter yourself, about this long, to convert the micro USB to Type-C, and then you can directly connect a Type-C cable. So, however, the downside is that there will be a protrusion here. It's up to everyone's choice. If you can accept this port, it might not affect you much. And then there's also the fact that it doesn't natively support back buttons. Because in games nowadays, having back buttons is quite comfortable, but it doesn't support them natively. Then there's another thing, which can't really be considered a drawback. It's about the version iteration issue. Since this controller has been around for many years, it has had two major iterations, namely the first and second generations. In the first generation, I remember there were 3 versions, and in the second generation, there were 2 versions, specifically the 040 motherboard and the 050 motherboard. First generation now, because the second generation definitely uses better materials. And some modification parts do not support the first generation. Many people buy this controller for modification, so if you don't support modification keys, then there's no need. Now let's talk about its actual experience on a PC. The first point is that its game compatibility is very poor. Well, it's not that the game compatibility is very poor, but rather the game's adaptability is poor. Compared to the Xbox controller, basically as long as your game supports controllers, you can play it. The difference is too much. There are too few games that natively support the DualShock controller, and it's very likely that after you plug in the controller, the game won't recognize it at all. But this problem is actually quite simple to solve. The first way is to use Steam input to simulate the controller as a cross-lever controller. However, if you're new to controllers and not very familiar with the buttons, then this method might not be suitable for you. Or you could buy a more suitable controller, because if you can't remember the buttons, even after simulating, you might not find the corresponding buttons. Then, if it's a game not downloaded from Steam or a non-Steam game, what should you do? You can also use this Steam emulation method. It's just that On Steam, there's an option to add non-Steam game. You add the game you want to play to the non-Steam list, and it can also perform a kind of emulating the controller. Or if you don't want to use Steam, you can download a third-party software, which is DSX. This is paid, or DS Window. Both of these software can simulate the PS controller as an Xbox controller. Then let's take a look at the PS5. In my personal opinion, there's not much difference between using a PS4 and a PS5 on a PC. Perhaps the PS5 feels a bit more comfortable to hold, and there are very few games that use the adaptive triggers. However, the advantage of the DS5 is that you can download its official software, where you can update its firmware and to some extent verify the authenticity of the PS5 controller. If you can't connect to the official software, then it's definitely fake.
Then afterward, let me give a personal purchasing suggestion. If your first controller...
I don't recommend buying it unless you want to play FPS games. But if you play FPS games, you basically need to modify it. Buying an original one might not be that good. If you don't want to modify it and just want to play FPS games directly, then if you don't want the hassle, I also suggest you buy a refurbished one from some reliable sellers. They might replace both joysticks with new ones, and the price might be a bit higher, but you can check the reviews of the store. Some sellers indeed do a very poor job with refurbishing. Another point to note is that when you buy a PS5, you must be careful. There are many that use a PS4 motherboard and modify it to look like a PS5 controller, then sell it to you at the PS5 price. However, the price they sell it for might be a bit cheaper than a PS5, but don't be tempted by the lower price. Moreover, some even use counterfeit PS4 controllers to modify into PS5 ones, so you end up buying a counterfeit PS4 controller, which is even more not worth it. That's about it for this. If there are any errors in the description, feel free to correct them in the comments. If you're interested in the video, you can keep following me. In the next episode, I might bring you the Soul controller. Let's see if I can get it by then. Also, please like, comment, and subscribe. It really means a lot to me. See you next time. Bye-bye.